My name is Jessica Miller, and I'm 39 years old as I sit down to tell you the story that has haunted, shaped, and ultimately defined my life. Before I begin, let me ask you, where in the world are you watching this from right now? And if you make it to the end, I'd love for you to rate this story from 1 to 10 in the comments, because your thoughts matter to me more than you know. My journey begins in a small Midwestern town where I grew up as the eldest daughter of strict, religious parents who valued appearances above all else. On the surface, our family looked picture perfect: a neat white house with trimmed hedges, Sunday church attendance, and a father who worked in finance while my mother stayed home, volunteering in community groups. But behind closed doors, I lived with parents who measured my worth by how well I performed in school, how I looked to neighbors, and how obediently I followed rules that often made no sense. Until the day I learned I was pregnant in 11th grade, I thought I knew who I was and where I belonged. That single secret, tiny and fragile, turned my whole world upside down. The moment I saw the positive test, fear and hope clashed inside me like a storm. I wasn't reckless, I wasn't wild. I had fallen in love with a boy from my high school, Daniel, who treated me with kindness in a way my parents never had. He wasn't rich, his family wasn't influential, but he cared about me genuinely. When I told him I was pregnant, his first reaction wasn't anger. It was shock followed by determination. He held my trembling hands and whispered that we would figure it out together. I clung to his words like a lifeline, because I already knew deep down my parents wouldn't stand by me. I had watched my mother judge other girls in our church community, whispering, "Such a shame," under her breath as though those girls carried sin itself on their shoulders. I knew I was next. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. I tried to hide my secret, but in a household obsessed with control, nothing stayed hidden long. When my mother found the crumpled test in my drawer, her screams shook the walls of our quiet home. My father didn't say much, he just stared at me with cold fury, like I had disgraced him personally. They didn't ask about Daniel, didn't ask how I felt, didn't even pause to consider what this meant for their daughter. Instead, they told me to pack my things. That night, as rain poured outside, I stuffed clothes into a duffel bag while my mother stood in the doorway, arms crossed. She said, "You're no longer our daughter. You made your bed, now lie in it." I'll never forget the way her voice cut me, like a blade sharper than any knife. My father's final words echoed as I stepped out into the wet darkness: "Don't come back." I was 17, scared, pregnant, and suddenly homeless, abandoned by the very people who were supposed to protect me. But that night, as the rain soaked through my jacket, I made a promise to myself and to the little life growing inside me, that I would survive, no matter what, and I would never let my child feel the same rejection I had just endured. The first weeks after being kicked out were the hardest days of my life. I was only 17, still technically a child, but I had to learn to survive overnight. Daniel, my boyfriend, did everything he could to help. His family didn't have much, and they lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment across town, but his mother, a kind woman who worked double shifts as a nurse, opened her door to me without hesitation. "You'll always have a place here," she told me as she handed me a warm blanket. That simple act of compassion felt like sunlight after weeks of cold rain. Still, the reality was harsh. I was a high school junior with a growing belly, whispers following me through hallways, teachers giving me sympathetic glances, and so-called friends avoiding me as if pregnancy were contagious. I remember walking down the hall one morning, books clutched tightly against my chest, when I overheard 2 girls I used to eat lunch with whispering, "She ruined her life." Can you imagine being her? I wanted to scream that I hadn't ruined anything, that I was creating life, but the words died in my throat. Instead, I held my head high, telling myself that one day I would prove them wrong. Daniel and I worked odd jobs after school. He stacked shelves at the grocery store, and I babysat whenever I could, though parents hesitated to leave their kids with a pregnant teenager. Money was tight, and the stress weighed heavily on us, but every night we whispered to each other about the future. He dreamed of joining the fire department, I dreamed of finishing school and maybe, one day, going to college. The baby became our shared hope, something that gave our struggles meaning. But as the months passed, Daniel and I started to feel the strain. He was still just a teenager, juggling school, work, and the pressure of becoming a father. We argued more, usually about money, or about how tired he was. One night, he slammed his fist against the table and shouted, "I'm doing everything I can, Jess," and I burst into tears because I knew he was right. We were both drowning, just trying to stay afloat. When my daughter, Emily, was born on a chilly November morning, everything changed. The moment I held her, tiny and perfect, with her father's dark eyes and my nose, I knew every sacrifice was worth it. Daniel cried as he kissed her forehead, promising her that he'd protect her forever. But promises made in the warmth of a hospital room don't always survive the cold reality outside. Within a year, Daniel was gone. Not because he didn't love us, but because the pressure became too much. He moved to another city to chase work opportunities, leaving me a single mother at 18. For a while, he called, sent letters, even visited once or twice, but eventually, the calls stopped. I don't blame him entirely. He was young, scared, and unprepared. But his absence left me with an even heavier burden. Raising Emily alone was brutal. I dropped out of high school to work full-time as a waitress, barely earning enough to cover diapers and rent. Nights were the worst. I'd rock Emily to sleep in the tiny corner of the apartment I shared with Daniel's mother, staring at her peaceful face while silently crying, terrified I wasn't enough for her. There were moments I almost gave up. But every morning, when Emily smiled at me with those dark eyes, I found strength I didn't know I had. I promised her we would rise above the labels, the shame, the rejection. Years passed, and slowly, painfully, I rebuilt my life. I earned my GED while Emily was in preschool, often studying late into the night after long shifts. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, textbooks open, coffee growing cold beside me, while Emily colored next to me, humming softly. She became my reason, my anchor. With time, opportunities opened up. I applied for scholarships and, against all odds, was accepted into a local college. Walking onto campus as a 22-year-old single mother wasn't easy, but I was determined. Emily cheered for me at my graduation years later, clapping so hard her little hands turned red. That day, I felt like I had reclaimed a piece of myself that my parents had stolen when they turned their backs on me. What made the story even more bitter was the silence from my parents. For years, not a single call, not a single letter. They had erased me as if I had never existed. And part of me thought I was okay with that. But deep inside, there was a wound that never healed, a wound that whispered, they didn't just abandon you, they abandoned your child too. I promised Emily that one day, when I was strong enough, we would face them again. But I never could have predicted how that confrontation would actually happen, and how, after 22 years of silence, it wouldn't be me knocking on their door. It would be them, taking me to court, demanding something I could never have imagined. My name is Emily Carter, and at this point in the story, I was already 33 years old, a single mother who had long since made peace with the fact that my parents had written me off 2 decades earlier. But nothing could have prepared me for the letter that arrived one cold January morning. The handwriting on the envelope felt all too familiar, my mother's looping cursive, etched in the same style she had used on birthday cards when I was a little girl. For a moment, my breath caught in my chest. Part of me wanted to rip it apart and throw it away, to refuse them entry into the life I had built after so much pain. But curiosity got the better of me, and when I tore it open, my entire world tilted on its axis. Inside was not an apology, not a reconciliation attempt, but a legal notice. My parents were suing me. They were claiming rights to a portion of the successful business I had worked day and night to build, the same business I created from the ground up when no one else believed in me. My eyes burned with tears as the words blurred in front of me. How could 2 people who had discarded me like trash when I needed them most now come back into my life demanding not only my attention but my livelihood? Viewers, can you imagine how you would feel if the very people who had once destroyed your spirit came crawling back, not with love, but with greed? Tell me in the comments if you think you could ever forgive such betrayal, and please don't forget to subscribe because what I'm about to share with you will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about family and justice. I sat down at my kitchen table, my daughter, now a teenager herself, looking at me with worry as I held the letter in shaking hands. "What is it, Mom?" she asked softly, her brown eyes filled with the same innocence I once carried before life broke me too early. How could I explain to her that the grandparents she never knew, the people who had thrown her unborn self away as a mistake, were now clawing at the empire we built together? I couldn't let her bear that pain, not when I had spent her whole life shielding her from it. But deep down, I also knew this wasn't just about money. This was about power, about control, about them realizing far too late that the girl they had called a disgrace had risen above their judgment, and they wanted a piece of the glory. Memories of that night when they shoved me out of their home, suitcase in hand, rushed back to me in waves. I remembered the cold air on my skin, the sting of my father's words, "You've ruined your life, and you've ruined ours. Don't ever come back." Those words had been etched into my soul, propelling me forward when I wanted to give up. And now, to think they had the audacity to stand before a court and demand I pay them, as if they had been my backbone all along, it filled me with a fire I hadn't felt in years. When I met with my lawyer, he flipped through the papers and raised an eyebrow. "Emily, this case is going to be brutal. They're claiming that because they once provided for you, because you were underage when you had your daughter, and because you lived in their house before they threw you out, they somehow contributed to your eventual success." The absurdity of it made me laugh through my tears. Contributed? By humiliating me, by leaving me homeless, by ensuring I never had a safety net? If anything, they contributed to my determination never to be like them, never to rely on anyone's approval to survive. As I sat there listening to the legal jargon, I realized this was no longer just about me. This was about every girl who had been cast aside by the people meant to protect her. This was about showing my daughter, and maybe even the world, that no one, not even family, had the right to take what you built with your own sweat and tears. And as painful as it was, I knew this fight was necessary. Would you fight back if you were in my shoes, or would you just walk away to protect your peace? Tell me from where you're watching this story and what you'd rate it so far, because I need to know. Do you think justice will side with me, or with the people who tried to erase me? Don't skip, because what comes next will shake you to your core. When the court proceedings began, I walked into that courtroom with my head held high, though my heart thundered in my chest like a drum. My parents sat on the opposite side, dressed in fine clothes, trying to look like the picture of dignity, as though they hadn't been the very people who had once kicked their 17-year-old daughter into the streets in the middle of the night. My mother's eyes met mine for just a second, and for the first time in decades, I saw something in them: shame? Regret? Or just the cold determination of someone who was ready to fight for money that wasn't theirs. Their lawyer stood up and painted a picture of my parents as misunderstood caregivers, who had given everything for me until I abandoned them. I almost laughed out loud at the word abandoned. How twisted the world could be when the truth got spun into something so distorted. My palms tightened into fists under the table, and my lawyer whispered for me to stay calm, to let the evidence speak. But I couldn't help but wonder, how many people in that courtroom believed their lies, and how many saw me as the ungrateful daughter they wanted me to be? When it was my turn to take the stand, I told my truth. I told the judge and jury about the night they pushed me out, about the harsh words my father spat as my mother stood silent. I described the loneliness of being pregnant and sleeping on a friend's couch, the shame I carried like a stone in my chest, the hunger I endured to make sure my unborn child would live. I spoke of the jobs I worked, cleaning houses, waiting tables, studying at night until I built a career, then a business, then an empire that no one, not even I, thought possible back when I was just a scared girl. My voice cracked as I looked directly at my parents and said, "You don't get to throw me away like trash and then come back decades later with open hands. You don't get to call my daughter a mistake and then claim her life is your success." The courtroom fell silent, the words echoing like thunder. Some people looked away, others nodded. I felt my daughter's gaze on me from the bench behind, her hand pressed to her heart. That moment wasn't just testimony, it was my soul laid bare. As the trial dragged on, they tried every tactic in the book. They brought up old photographs, family acquaintances, even fabricated stories of how they had supported me financially during my early years. But the truth was stronger than their lies. My lawyer produced evidence of my bank accounts, the scholarships I fought for, the sweat I put into building my business brick by brick. He reminded the court that these same parents hadn't even attended my high school graduation because they were too ashamed of my pregnancy, that they hadn't seen their granddaughter until she was old enough to speak. Every document, every testimony from friends and colleagues who had stood by me, tore holes in their case until their argument looked like nothing more than greed stitched together with desperation. Still, the toll was heavy on me. Each night, I'd sit in bed with tears streaming down my face, wondering why, after all these years, they couldn't just let me live in peace. But I'll tell you something, my friends watching this, the strength you don't know you have only reveals itself when you're pushed into the fire. I realized this battle wasn't breaking me, it was forging me. The same way the cruelty of my past had pushed me to rise, this present trial was shaping me into someone unshakable. And I know many of you watching might have faced betrayal too. Maybe not from parents, but from people you trusted, people who should have loved you but instead tried to destroy you. Tell me, from where are you watching, and what do you think so far? Rate this story honestly, I want to know if it speaks to you. And don't forget, your support by subscribing keeps stories like mine alive, stories that show we are stronger than betrayal. Because the day the verdict came in, it changed everything. The day of the verdict arrived like the slowest sunrise of my life. I barely slept the night before, pacing the length of my room, staring at the ceiling, clutching my daughter's photograph as though it could anchor me to something steady. When I finally walked into that courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. Reporters lined the halls, whispers filled the room, and every eye seemed to fall on me as though waiting to see if I would crack under the weight of 2 decades of pain colliding with this very moment. My parents sat across from me, stiff and proud, their lawyer's briefcase snapping open as if he already expected victory. My daughter squeezed my hand before I took my seat, her whisper in my ear carrying me through. No matter what, Mom, you already won. You showed me what strength looks like. That sentence alone made me realize, even if the judge made the worst decision, I had already written a different legacy than the one my parents gave me. I had broken the cycle. The judge entered, his face unreadable as he shuffled through the documents before him. Every tick of the clock was a hammer against my chest. He cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice steady but powerful. After reviewing the evidence, testimony, and arguments, this court finds that the plaintiff's claims hold no merit. There is no legal or moral basis for them to demand financial compensation from the defendant. My breath caught as the words settled in. My parents' faces drained of color, my mother's lips trembling, my father gripping the table so hard his knuckles went white. The judge went further, stating plainly that the case itself seemed to stem from malice and opportunism, and he warned them against any further attempts to exploit me or my business. In that instant, every bruise of my past, every lonely night, every cruel word they had thrown at me, it all turned into ashes. I hadn't just won legally. I had won spiritually. I had proven to myself, to my daughter, and maybe even to every young woman who had been tossed aside, that survival wasn't enough, you could rise, and you could thrive. Walking out of that courtroom, the cameras flashed in my face, and journalists shouted questions, but all I could hear was my daughter's laughter as she hugged me tightly. You did it, Mom, she cried, her tears dampening my shoulder. I wanted to tell her that no, we did it. Because every sleepless night I worked, every sacrifice I made, every moment I chose to keep going when giving up would have been easier, I did it all with her in my heart. I looked back once at my parents, watching them shrink into the shadows as the crowd surged around me, and for the first time, I didn't feel hate. I didn't feel vengeance. I felt pity. They had thrown me away, and in doing so, they had thrown away their chance at love, at family, at redemption. Now, all they had left was the echo of what could have been. That night, my daughter and I sat on our porch, watching the stars flicker above us. Mom, she whispered, are you okay? I smiled, brushing her hair back gently. I am now, I said. And I meant it. I wasn't just okay, I was free. Free from their judgment, free from their control, free from the chains of a past that no longer defined me. The lawsuit had been their last weapon, and it failed. My story wasn't one of victimhood anymore, it was one of victory. And as I sipped my tea under the night sky, I thought of the girl I had been at 17, standing outside her parents' door with tears freezing on her cheeks. If only she could see me now. And to you, watching this story from wherever you are in the world, I want to ask you, if you were in my shoes, could you forgive? Or would you walk away like I did, leaving the past behind? Drop your answer in the comments, and tell me from where you're watching. Rate this story and share it with someone who needs to hear it, because you never know who might be carrying the same weight I once did. And please, subscribe to Outstanding Stories, because together, we can keep sharing voices that remind us all, no matter who tries to bury you, you have the power to rise.